The air in Port Obsidian's lower markets reeked of desperation and stale recycled oxygen. Jace Sterling kept his head down as he navigated through the maze of questionable vendors, his worn leather jacket doing little to ward off the chill that permeated the station's forgotten depths. He'd made this run 100 times, always looking for cheap parts to keep his aging cargo hauler flying for another month, another job, another empty voyage through the void. The market sprawled across 3 levels of what used to be a mining station before the corporations abandoned it. Now it served as a haven for those who operated outside the bounds of civilized space. Jace had stopped caring about such distinctions years ago, after the war took everything from him. All that mattered now was survival, one credit at a time. He pushed past a cluster of Thorgan merchants, arguing over the price of stolen medical supplies, his dark eyes scanning the cluttered stalls for the parts dealer he'd dealt with before. Instead, his gaze caught on something that made his stomach turn. At the far end of the corridor, beneath flickering lights that cast sickly shadows, stood a reinforced cage. Jace tried to look away. He'd learned long ago that getting involved in other people's problems was a fast track to getting killed. But something about the figure huddled in that cage pulled at him like gravity. Against his better judgment, he moved closer. The cage contained perhaps a dozen beings, various species, all wearing the dull expressions of those who'd given up hope. But one stood out. A girl, barely more than a child by any species standards, with skin the color of twilight and silver hair that caught the dim light like starfire. She knelt in the corner of the cage, her small hands wrapped around the bars, and when she looked up, Jace felt something crack inside his carefully constructed armor of indifference. Her eyes were enormous, an otherworldly shade of violet that seemed to see straight through him. They were filled with tears, but also with a desperate intelligence that suggested she understood exactly what fate awaited her. Move along. Human, unless you're buying. A gravelly voice interrupted his thoughts. Jace turned to face Gorduk, a Krellin whose bulk filled the narrow corridor like a wall of scarred muscle. The slave trader's 4 arms were crossed over his massive chest. His tusked face twisted into what might have been a smile. "Just looking," Jace replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Then look elsewhere." Gordek's small eyes narrowed. "These are premium merchandise. Velesian refugees, captured before they could reach sanctuary. Very rare now since their world burned." Jace's jaw tightened. He'd heard about Velesia. Everyone had. An entire civilization wiped out in territorial disputes, the survivors scattered across the galaxy like ash. "You're trafficking children now?" "I trade in commodities," Gorduk corrected, his voice dripping with false civility. "That one in particular fetches a high price. Velesians are empathic, you see. Very desirable for certain collectors who appreciate exotic playthings." The casual cruelty in those words made Jace's fists clench. The girl in the cage was watching their exchange, and he could swear he felt something emanating from her. Not thoughts exactly, but emotions, waves of fear and desperate hope that crashed over him like a tide. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the market's din. The universal translator built into the station's systems rendered her words in standard. "Please, buy me. Take me as your servant. I will work hard. I promise." The naked pleading in her tone hit Jace like a physical blow. He'd seen plenty of suffering in his 32 years, had caused his share of it during the war, but something about this broke through his defenses. "How much?" The words came out before he could stop them. Gordak's expression shifted to one of greedy interest. "For her alone? 12,000 credits. But I have a special offer. Take 3, and I'll give you a discount." Jace had exactly 11,000 credits to his name. His ship needed a new stabilizer. His supplies were running low, and he had debts to pay. Spending everything on a slave girl was insane. It was suicide. It was exactly the kind of impulsive idiocy that had gotten him court-martialed years ago. "I'll give you 10,000, he heard himself saying. "For her only." 12, Gordic countered firmly. "She's worth more, but I'm feeling generous today." The girl's violet eyes never left Jace's face. He could feel her hope building, a tangible thing that seemed to wrap around his heart and squeeze. Whatever empathic abilities her people possessed, they were working overtime now. Jace thought about his ship, about the stabilizer that would fail eventually, about being stranded in some backwater system with no way out. Then he looked at those eyes again and knew he'd already lost this argument with himself. 11,000, he said flatly. "It's all I have. Take it or I walk." Gordic studied him for a long moment, then shrugged his 4 shoulders. "Fine, but only because you're clearly a fool, and I enjoy taking advantage of fools." The transaction took less than 5 minutes. Jace's credit chip was emptied, his financial security obliterated with a few swipes on Gordoc's datapad. In return, he received a slave collar remote and the codes to unlock the cage. The other slaves watched with dead eyes as he opened the door and the Valizian girl stumbled out, her legs shaky from confinement. She was even smaller than he'd thought, barely reaching his chest. The tattered remains of what might have once been a formal garment hung on her thin frame. Bruises marked her violet skin, and her silver hair was matted with filth. "What's your name?" Jace asked quietly as he led her away from the cage, away from Gordic's leering grin. "Nira," she whispered, her hand finding his arm and gripping it like a lifeline. "I am called Nira. I'm Jace." He looked down at her, at those impossibly large eyes now brimming with grateful tears. "And I didn't buy you as a servant. I bought your freedom. Understand?" She stared at him in confusion, as if the concept itself was foreign. Then something shifted in her expression, a dawning wonder that made her face transform despite the dirt and bruises. "Freedom?" she repeated, testing the word. "Yeah." Jace sighed, already regretting this decision even as he knew he'd make it again. "Come on. Let's get you out of this hellhole." As they walked through the market toward the docking levels, Jace wondered what he'd just gotten himself into. He was broke, responsible for a traumatized alien child, and had no plan beyond getting back to his ship. Behind them, he could hear Gordoc laughing, a sound that promised this simple act of compassion would come with complications he couldn't yet imagine. Nira stumbled beside him, her small hand still clutching his arm, and Jace felt her emotions washing over him like radiation. Fear, yes, but also hope, and something else he couldn't quite name. Whatever empathic connection she'd forged with him in that moment by the cage, it ran deeper than he was comfortable with. "I can feel your regret," she said softly, as they reached the lift that would take them to the upper levels. "You are uncertain." "Kid, uncertain doesn't begin to cover it," Jace admitted. The lift doors opened, and they stepped inside. "But we'll figure something out." As the lift descended toward the docking bay, where his ship waited, Jace caught their reflection in the polished metal doors. A scarred human veteran and a frightened alien child. They looked like the beginning of a very bad joke. Or maybe, he thought with a rueful smile, the beginning of something else entirely. The cargo hauler Wandering Star had seen better days. Hell, it had seen better decades. Jace guided Nira through the cramped corridors of his ship, acutely aware of how shabby everything must look through her eyes. Exposed wiring snaked along the walls, where panels had been removed and never replaced. The deck plates were scuffed and dented from years of hard use. The whole vessel groaned and shuddered as the life support systems struggled to maintain atmosphere. "It's not much," he said, breaking the silence that had settled between them during the walk from Port Obsidian's markets. "But it's home." Nira said nothing, her violet eyes taking in every detail. She still wore that damned collar around her neck, a thick band of dull metal that marked her as property. Jace had tried to remove it at the docking bay, but the locking mechanism was beyond his ability to crack without proper tools. "First things first," he said, guiding her toward the small refresher unit. "You need to get cleaned up. There's soap in there, and the water actually runs hot if you're patient." He rummaged through a storage locker and pulled out one of his old shirts. "This will be huge on you, but it's clean." She took the shirt with trembling hands, her fingers brushing against his. The contact sent a jolt through him, not physical but emotional. He felt her gratitude like a wave, mixed with fear and confusion, and something else he couldn't identify. "The empathy thing," he said awkwardly. "Can you control it?" "I do not know," Nira admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "My parents were teaching me before." She stopped, her expression crumbling. "Before they died." Jace felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "I'm sorry, kid." "Everyone is sorry," she said with a bitterness that seemed too old for her young face. "Sorry does not bring back the dead." Before he could respond, she slipped into the refresher and closed the door. Jace stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the sound of running water, and wondered what the hell he was supposed to do now. He'd saved her from immediate danger, sure, but what came next? He had no credits, no plan, and no idea how to care for a traumatized alien child. He made his way to the cockpit and slumped into the pilot's chair, staring at the financial readouts on his console. Empty, completely cleaned out. The stabilizer warning light blinked red, a constant reminder that his ship was on borrowed time. 20 minutes later, Nira emerged from the refresher, looking marginally better. His shirt hung on her like a tent, the sleeves dangling past her hands. Her silver hair was still wet, plastered against her neck and shoulders. Without the grime covering her face, she looked even younger than he'd thought. Maybe 12, maybe 13 in human terms. Hard to tell with aliens. "Thank you," she said quietly, hovering in the doorway. "Don't mention it." Jace gestured to the co-pilot's chair. "Hungry?" She nodded eagerly, and he couldn't help but smile at the enthusiasm. At least feeding her was something concrete he could do. He heated up 2 ration packs, military surplus he'd been living on for months. They were bland and barely nutritious, but they were food. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the constant hum of the ship's engines. Nira devoured her meal with desperate intensity, and Jace made a mental note to ration carefully. With no credits, he couldn't afford to restock supplies. "What will you do with me?" Nira asked suddenly, her violet eyes fixed on him with unnerving intensity. "I told you," Jace said. "You're free." "I'm not going to do anything with you. But where will I go?" Her voice cracked. "My world is gone. My people are scattered or dead. I have nothing." The raw pain in her words made Jace's chest ache. He set down his ration pack and leaned forward, trying to find words that wouldn't sound hollow. "Look, I don't have all the answers. But for now, you're safe here. We'll figure out the rest as we go." "You do not have to keep me," Nira said, her voice small. "I know I am a burden. I can feel your worry, your regret." "Stop," Jace interrupted gently. "Yeah, I'm worried. Yeah, this complicates things. But I don't regret getting you out of that cage. And you're not a burden. Understand? You're a kid who got dealt a shit hand. That's not your fault." Tears welled up in her eyes, and suddenly she was crying in earnest, her small body shaking with sobs. Without thinking, Jace moved to her side and awkwardly put an arm around her shoulders. She collapsed against him, weeping into his chest, and he felt every ounce of her grief and fear through their contact dot. It was overwhelming, like drowning in someone else's emotions. He understood now why empaths were so valuable and so feared. This kind of connection was intimate in a way that transcended normal communication. "It's okay," he murmured, the platitude meaningless but necessary. "Let it out." They stayed like that for a long time, the ship drifting in the void while Nira grieved for everything she'd lost. Jace held her and tried not to think about how his life had just become infinitely more complicated. Eventually, her tears subsided. She pulled away, wiping her face with the oversized sleeve of his shirt. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Nothing to be sorry for." Jace stood, his knees protesting. "Getting old," he thought ruefully. "You should rest. Take the bunk in the crew quarters. I'll sleep in the cockpit." "I do not want to be alone," Nira admitted, her voice trembling. "The darkness it reminds me of?" She stopped, shuddering. "Okay," Jace said softly. "I'll leave the door open. And if you need anything, just call out." She nodded gratefully and disappeared into the small crew quarters. Jace returned to the cockpit, his mind racing. He needed credits, fast, but with the ship in its current condition, taking on cargo jobs was risky. And he couldn't exactly drag a kid into dangerous situations. He was still puzzling over his options when the proximity alarm chimed. Someone was hailing him. Jace frowned and pulled up the communication panel. The face that appeared on screen made his breath catch. Sienna Roth. He'd know those features anywhere. Sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and hair the color of burnished copper pulled back in a practical braid. She wore a fitted flight suit that accentuated her athletic build, and her expression was carefully neutral. "Jace Sterling," she said, her voice like honey in smoke. "It's been a long time, Sienna." He tried to keep his tone casual, though his heart was suddenly racing. "What do you want?" "I heard you made an interesting purchase at Port Obsidian," she said, one eyebrow arching. "A Valision child. That's not like you. Times change. People change." Jace leaned back in his chair, trying to appear relaxed. "How do you find me?" "I have my sources." Sienna's smile was enigmatic. "I also heard you're broke. That stabilizer won't hold much longer. I'll manage. Will you?" She leaned closer to her screen, and Jace was reminded of why he'd fallen for her years ago, before everything went to hell. "I have a proposition. I need someone to transport cargo to the Epsilon sector. It's legitimate, pays well, and you'd be doing me a favor." "What's the catch?" Jace asked suspiciously. "No catch. Just business." Her expression softened slightly. "And maybe a chance to talk. We didn't exactly part on good terms." That was putting it mildly. Their last conversation had ended with her walking away while he was in a military prison cell, awaiting court-martial for refusing an illegal order. He'd expected her to wait for him. She'd expected him to follow orders. Neither had budged. "I'll think about it," Jace said finally. "Don't think too long. The offer expires in 12 hours. Sienna's image flickered. "And Jace? Be careful with that girl. There are people looking for Valisians. People who won't be as gentle as Gordok." The screen went dark before he could respond. Jace sat in the darkness of the cockpit, his mind churning. Sienna Roth, after all these years. The woman he'd loved and lost. The woman who'd chosen her career over him. And now she was offering him exactly what he needed, right when he needed it most. Who was that? Nira's voice made him jump. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, her violet eyes curious. "An old friend," Jace said. "Maybe. She cares about you," Nira observed. "I can feel it, even through the recording. But she is also afraid. Yeah, well, join the club." Jace stood and stretched. "Come on, kid. Let's both get some sleep. Things will look better in the morning." But as he settled into the pilot's chair, watching Nira curl up in the co-pilot's seat, despite his protests about the bunk. Jace knew things were only going to get more complicated. Sienna's reappearance wasn't coincidence, and her warning about people hunting the Lysians made his blood run cold. He looked at Nira's sleeping form, so small and vulnerable, and felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he had something worth protecting. Someone who depended on him. Outside the viewport, stars wheeled slowly in the darkness. 12 hours until Sienna's offer expired. 12 hours to decide whether to trust the woman who'd broken his heart, or try to make it alone with nothing but fumes in the tank and hope in his pocket. Jace closed his eyes and tried to sleep. But all he could see was Sienna's face, and all he could feel was Nira's emotions bleeding through the air like radiation. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the stabilizer warning chime again, a death knell for his ship, and maybe for his chances of keeping this kid safe. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor, and Jace Sterling was the punchline.